Okay, ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you to go back to your seats, and I'll also welcome all the participants online for this final session, this final panel of this conference on secondary sanctions. In this final panel, we'll have adopt a forward-looking perspective. The title of the panel is What Lies Ahead of Us, and I'm very glad that we have some distinguished speakers. We'll first start with Alina Nedea from the European Commission. She's the head of the sanctions units, working in the European Commission with a lot of experience on all kinds of questions, legal questions related to sanctions. So she is the perfect person, I would say, to kick off this panel with a presentation on the revamping of the EU blocking statute. We have a slight change in the program of this panel in the sense that the second speaker, Mr. Changai Chai, pronounce it correctly, from Fudan University, unfortunately cannot connect online, but he recorded his presentation. But I propose that we will see whether we have time at the very end, at the end of the three presentations of people that are present, either here or online, that we will then watch his recorded presentation at the very end of the panel. So it means that at the second speaker, we will have an online participant, which is Mr. Jonathan Hackenbroich, probably if I pronounce it correctly. You can correct me when you when you have the floor, from the European Council on Foreign Relations, who will follow up on the presentation by Alina Nedea with a presentation on the toolbox for confronting the secondary sanctions. We will discuss the policy options for the European Union, so building upon this discussion. And also the third speaker will focus on this particular question, the new EU anti-coercion instruments, the question whether the EU will finally get some teeth in response to US and probably also Chinese secondary sanctions. So the last speaker will be Dr. Stefano Siligardi, who is here with us from the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. So without further ado, I propose that we start with our first speaker, Mrs. Alina Nedea. I hope you are online, you can see her already. So as we agreed, you have 15 to 20 minutes for your presentation, so you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and many thanks to the university for the invitation, and many thanks for also accepting presentations from elsewhere than in that absolutely gorgeous meeting room you're in. Unfortunately, I could not be physically there, but I'm very happy that I managed to connect nevertheless. I think that the bar is extremely high. I've tried to listen during the morning and also yesterday. Yesterday was less success. So the bar is extremely high. I'm going to do my best, and I'm glad that this panel is about looking forward, because I would have had a very difficult time participating in a debate about what was discussed today by such distinguished legal guests that you've had. So looking forward, but before we look forward, I think I wanted to give you a brief historical overview of the blocking statute. And it's not to go into the history of the instrument as such, but maybe to just make a link the way we look at it. The blocking statute and the stance of the EU that it reflects is also very much in tune, or has been very much in tune with the changes that have occurred throughout the relatively recent history, I would say, in foreign policy, and particularly in the relations so far between the EU and the US, but also regarding the EU's role in the world. So if you look at the time when the blocking statute was adopted in 1996, it was the first time that the EU was actually stepping up its game and telling a thus far trusted and even beyond that partner no more. And that was in the context of the adoption of the D'Amato and Helms-Burton laws by the US, which had significant impact on the EU interests by prohibiting certain EU operators from engaging in business that they were interested in. So that was the first step in reaction to this policy by the US. The next big important step, I would say, in the life of the blocking statute came many years after, and that is in 2018, when something again unprecedented happened, and that something is the US unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear agreement. And that there again, against all odds, I would say, depending on some of the people who have written about that, against all odds, the EU decided to yet again stand up to the principle and say, for the principle, and say this is unacceptable. And that's when it revived this text of 1996, which was there pretty much dormant for many different reasons. One of them being that the sanctions were relatively aligned for a long time between the EU and the US, hence there was no significant impact in theory of what we call US extraterritorial sanctions. So that was the second big moment in the history of the blocking statute. Yet again, it came as a reaction, as some sort of a wake up of the EU to a situation, international situation, geopolitical situation that it was facing. And I would say that the third important moment started at some point in 2020, 2021, where with the new commission, and it's not only because of that, but situation simply converged. The new European Commission decided that it was about time for the EU to somehow step up its game. We were coming from several years where there had been attacks, if I can call them like that, on the EU autonomy, on its ability to decide and implement the policies it wants, on its ability to dictate rules for its own citizens and businesses without interference from abroad. And that's a moment that where this conscience of the need to be more resilient, of the need to ensure that we are indeed strategically autonomous, came to life. And you've seen perhaps in the very early months of this year, the communication that we've issued on resilience and strategic autonomy. And you also see several other instruments that are being in the pipeline. So when we speak of autonomy of the EU, I think it's very important to say that this wake up is not a reaction to the US. I think it would be extremely unfair, and I think speakers before me have said it already. It would be extremely unfair to watch this attitude and this decision of the EU as simply anti-US stance, which it is not. The US remains a most trusted and long-standing partner of the EU. It's simply a realization that it is not only the US which can impose extraterritorial sanctions. Anyone actually could, with more or less success, but there are other actors out there which could quite successfully probably be tempted to do the same thing. So this is the one realization. The other realization is that in the past few years, and also looking to the mid-term ahead, the pressure on the EU or on its operators to determine their behavior in one way or another is absolutely unacceptable. And that's not only a matter of principle that we do not accept others to interfere in our behavior, it is also a matter of very political and policy perspective, which is that we want to be able to adopt our own policy, and we want those policies to work. Whereas if others interfere in them unlawfully, as we consider is the case for extraterritorial sanctions, then our policies won't work, and then we will not be autonomous. We will not be able to conduct those policies the way we would want them to. And you have seen, and I think my fellow co-panelists are going to discuss this later on. You have seen quite significant studies being presented out there, and Jonathan is the co-author of a very important one. You have seen the Commission's announcement on the anti-coercion instrument, which tackles a all forms of coercion against the EU. And of course, we're here to talk about the blocking statute, which is yet another initiative in this area. Now, what do we want to do with the amendment to the blocking statute? Now, really looking forward. If I had to say it in only 2 words, I would say what we want to do is to stand up. On the one hand, to stand up for the principle that every jurisdiction should legislate only for its own operators, only for those which are subject to its own rules and jurisdiction. And on the other hand, we want to stand up in defense of our economic and not only economic operators, which have been affected by what we call extraterritorial rules, and which have been calling for support and for better protection by the EU for quite some time now. And the way we think we could do that, and the way we are approaching the amendment to the blocking statute is through two main objectives, I would say. The first one, which would make the second one redundant, actually, if we succeed, would be to deter the imposition of extraterritorial sanctions in the first place. That would be, of course, the perfect situation, the ideal world where international actors would no longer impose this kind of measures affecting our operators. Now, if we succeed, that is excellent. And then, as I was saying, we would not need to worry about the second objective. But if we do not succeed, or we do not fully succeed in the first one, the other main objective of the amendment to the blocking statute would be to protect European operators as much as we can, knowing that we will probably not be able to protect them fully because the world is globalized. The world is interdependent, so there will be situations where there is not very much that we can do to protect and to help out. So these would be the main 2 objectives, and to achieve those 2 objectives, we are proposing, well, not yet, but we will very shortly be proposing a significant, we think, amendment to the blocking statute, which builds on 2 main axes. So on the one hand, we would want to streamline the provisions that are already in the blocking statute and which, true, have not delivered to their best potential, but on the other hand, could be improved and could be made to work much better than they have so far. So it's not only that those measures are insufficient, it's part of the problem. It's also that the good measures that are in there were not sufficiently clear, were not sufficiently streamlined, were not sufficiently understandable either for economic operators or for national authorities, or in some cases, even for national courts. So this is the first area where we want to intervene. So to streamline the procedure, the provisions that are already there, the protective provisions that we have already included, and also to incentivize economic and non-economic operators to use them. And let me give you just one example. We currently have in the blocking statute a provision which says all persons affected by extraterritorial sanctions are supposed to notify the Commission within 30 days of knowing that this is the case, of the impact that extraterritorial sanctions have on them. Now, it is no secret, and you may have seen the report that the Commission published on the basis of such notifications. This provision has been extremely used very, very little. Now, why is that? Among other things, because what we have heard from operators is, what for? So, okay, we're going to come to the Commission, we're going to tell the Commission what exactly is wrong. What is going to happen afterwards? Is it just a letter that we send? Is it just a stamp that we need to buy, an email, yet another email that we need to send to the Commission? What's in it for us, and what will the Commission do with this information afterwards? And this is something that the blocking statute does not clarify. And this is something that we would, of course, want to clarify in order to incentivize people to tell us the amount and the extent of the problem in the first place. So that's much about the streamlining of the existing provisions. And the other main area of intervention when we speak about the reform of the blocking statute is concerns countermeasures. And that is a big step, because apart from the fact that we allow already today with the text that we have EU operators to use the clawback clause, which you have found in Article 6 of the blocking statute, we don't have any sort of real countermeasures in the existing legal act. What we want to do, and I think it was mentioned in the previous panel, is to give the blocking statute teeth and to give it clause in order to make it a credible instrument to deter, and if it is not possible to deter, then to counter the imposition of extraterritorial sanctions in the first place. We have carried out already, so these two main objectives and axes of intervention are already public. We have mentioned them on several occasions. We have meanwhile already also closed a public consultation into our preliminary ideas about how to improve the existing blocking statute. And unsurprisingly, I would say, we have received a significant number of replies. At times, I think they even exceeded what we were expecting. Very detailed replies on many occasions. Lots of companies, of associations, of federations, and lawyers, businesses, and so on, but also researchers have decided to not only to click the button on to the questions that next to the questions that we were asking, but also to give us comments, feedback, suggestions in the more detailed boxes. And that has been extremely enriching for us and extremely helpful to have as feedback. I can tell you that the overall feeling among the respondents was, and this is certainly not a praise to the EU, that the blocking statute that, as it currently is, has not been effective. This is something we knew. This is something it has taken us a lot of quite some time, and also a lot of self-reflection to admit. So here we are. This is why we are amending it in the first place. There is also among the respondents a overwhelming support to improving the functioning of the blocking statute, and to do so, and this was quite telling, at the EU level. There were quite a few questions in the public questionnaire which were giving the respondents the option to between leaving certain measures at the level of the member states for implementation and for application, or making them EU level measures. And I would say on this one, surprisingly, because we did not know exactly what to expect, most of the respondents have said that they prefer the reaction to be taken at EU level. When I say surprisingly, is because you never know what businesses would necessarily want, whether they would want to be discussing with their national authorities, which are perhaps more receptive to their concerns, or whether they would want to discuss with the EU, with the Commission, and potentially other institutions in Brussels. Needless to say, for us, the outcome, the desired outcome was quite clear. We think that it is very difficult, and I hope that my fellow co-panelists will agree, and also the public. It is extremely difficult for any given member state to achieve the results that we are talking about here at national level. So we're quite happy with the feedback on this point. Now, I will not hide that there was varied feedback from the respondents on how exactly to do so. Feedback which ranges from rather extreme positions of just do away with the blocking statute, and that would be the best thing you can do about it, because let's face it, we have no choice but to abide by US sanctions, and that's what we're going to continue doing in any event. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that this is not really the direction we're going to go into, because of everything I've told you so far, because of the need to stand up for the principle, but also in defense of those who do not think this way. There are also others which would go for extremely high penalties, and would let me caricature here, and I'll continue on that line for a second, to throw in jail everybody who dares to even pay attention to US sanctions. We have sectors of what we very commonly call the real economy, saying, oh, the actual evil people in all this are the banks, because they are the ones making US sanctions really applicable in the EU. They're cutting us the financing. We want to be engaged in Iran, we want to go to Cuba, but they don't let us. I'm still categorizing. I have not closed that parenthesis. Whereas you have obviously the banking sector saying the exact opposite. And I think in both cases, if one puts oneself in the shoes of the respondent, one understands perhaps why this is so. So that's another reason why we're extremely happy that the respondents were so varied from so many sectors of the economy, because that allows us to see the positions in the very different sectors, which have, of course, very different exposure to extraterritorial sanctions as they are today. So I think I've spoken quite enough. I will leave it at that. I will understand that you're a bit disappointed that I'm not able to tell you exactly what we're going to do, because we're not yet there. I think that the ideas are pretty clear, but we're still clearing them further with hierarchies. The timeline says that we will very soon publish a summary of the replies so that everybody knows what was said, more or less. We'll try to make it as comprehensive a summary as possible. And then the next big step for us will be, a public step will be to make a proposal, a legislative proposal to amend the blocking statute, which we expect to have at some point in the month of April next year. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, also in view of the presentations that will come after me, is the fact that there has been significant work ongoing in order to make sure that this procedure and this initiative, which is amending the blocking statute and making it stronger, is perfectly compatible and consistent with the other big initiative that is going on at the same time, a little bit faster than ours, which is the anti-coercion instrument. And I'm pretty sure that there will be questions on how the two interlink, so I won't go into further details on that at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alina, for your presentation and for informing us about the current state of play with respect to the revision of the blocking statute. I'm sure that will raise quite some questions. We'll come back to them in the Q&A session. But first, I propose we move the floor and we give the floor to Jonathan Hackenbroich. I'll leave it here to pronounce your surname correctly. I'm sorry for my mispronunciation, most likely. But he will look at the issue of how the EU can confront the issue of secondary sanctions, more from a think tank perspective, since he's working at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So, Jonathan, you will get the floor.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Hackenbroich would be the perfect way, but that's never been done. So I have no problem at all with any kind of pronunciation, and I think you tried very well. but thanks so much for inviting me onto this panel. To the conference. I'm very happy to be there, at least virtually. Not so happy not to be there in person. I would have loved to come to Ghent, but of course we know the current situation has not made it easier, and so I'll present from here. But really happy to be on this panel and to be speaking after Alina, which is always great, and to be on a panel with her and with my co-panelists. What we have done, and I will start my putting up my slides is here, so I hope it will work. I think it's working. Yeah, great. What we have done at the ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations, for the last 2 years, and it's still ongoing, but is put together a task force of member state governments and the private sector to think about the topic of economic coercion, and one of the forms, but one that figured quite prominently of economic coercion that we thought about was secondary sanctions, and but the point being that that we did put it into or look at it in the larger framework of a larger trend towards the weaponization, if you want to call it that way, or to the use of economic tools for geopolitical in the geopolitical competition, where economic tools or leveraging economic pressure has become the _1 foreign policy tool for a range of countries. And it just so happens that that the US has significant leverage through the dollar and can use financial sanctions and secondary sanctions, especially to with great reach, as everyone here in this conference knows. So this task force, in the task force, we looked at these. Let me see if I can. At this broader trend, and I'll just start talking about the broader trend just for 2 minutes, and then I'll go into what the results were of the task force work over these 2 years, where we discussed and brainstormed and discussed in detail all kinds of options of how to respond to secondary sanctions or economic coercion more largely, and each time looked at, for each of the tools in the toolbox, looked at how could this work in the best case scenario, how even if we leave political desirability aside. I mean, we always had that in mind and didn't come up with anything crazy, I hope and think, but still for a moment just brainstorming and thinking about what tool could work, how could it work, but then also what are the difficulties and why may it not be the best tool to respond to economic coercion and secondary sanctions in particular. And this of course came from this notion that in this changing world, where you can see a lot more of the use of economic pressure in foreign policy, that we struggle as Europeans in general, and certainly on secondary sanctions, to find the right responses, because we don't want to, and that's not the goal, to become like those who use economic pressure in WTO illegal ways or so. And we have a great interest and value a rules-based trade and the rules-based international order, but at the same time we're starting to understand that just remaining vulnerable and just hoping for others to not use secondary sanctions or other forms of economic coercion has never been enough, and is getting more difficult, possibly with ever more increasing use of such measures. So just the sort of big picture zoom out for just a second, where we see that just a reminder, many of you know these figures or know figures like these, where a group of just on the economic weight that Europe has in the world, and therefore the question of how much does our vision of liberal rules-based trade get shared around the world, and how much weight does it have if all others or many others, some others, depending on your viewpoint, intertwine geopolitics and economics much more, and where it's much more where it's much more intuitive for them to use economic tools to get to a geopolitical advantage, or vice versa, geopolitical tools for economic advantage. And these figures are just a reminder that the E7, emerging 7 countries, which is a wide range of countries, from China to Russia to India, Mexico, but many of them, Saudi Arabia, many of them not making that traditional distinction, where that economics is a rules-based sphere and shouldn't be used for geoeconomics or geopolitics. And this group was about 35% of the world's GDP in 1991. while the G7 was, of course, the big anchor and had the most weight in the international economy. And by 2050, a very rough estimate, just to show a trend, is that these emerging 7 will account for 50% of world GDP, while the G7 only for 20%. And so that's the very long-term vision. And if we wanted to group them from a strategic point of view, geopolitical point of view, this is a sort of menu of tools of economic coercion that get used offensively. Offensive tools that we would say is also trade deals. Those are positive offensive tools, positive agenda for our trade deals, in connectivity deals and agreements on the agreements or to cooperate and to closer integrate into economically. But there's also negative offensive tools, and those can be economically coercive, like punitive tariffs, like we've seen. Boycotts, export controls can be used in such ways. And then precisely one of those tools, secondary sanctions. And then there's a whole list of defensive tools of how countries try to protect themselves from the use of these of such negative offensive tools. And finally, just as part of the overview, what we must not forget with all of this, of course, is that we can build as many defensive tools as we'd like, but ultimately a key determinant or factor of our protection, even against secondary sanctions, is our own economic strength and the fact that that we have asymmetries in our favor in economic relations with others, that we're innovative, that we're attractive partners. That goes a long way in general, not in the particular situation of when you face economic coercion, but it does go a long way in protecting Europe from it in general and structurally. So I will just jump right into the toolbox that we have thought about, and these are the 11 options that you can see, and I will go into several or many in detail, and will be available for more questions on others, because I won't be able to cover all of them in detail. If you're very interested in one that I don't talk about, then there's the report that we've put out, which details all these things. And what we did here, once again, was think about very different ways: financial policy responses, possible financial policy responses, possible regulatory policy responses, possible trade policy responses, institutional responses, and so forth, for protecting Europe against secondary sanctions, other forms of economic coercion. And I will just point to one, for instance, before going into detail, that's on the left-hand side, the question of digital currencies and the question to which extent they can help with resilience to secondary sanctions, and where this sort of, if I had to put it in one sentence, result was that technically speaking, that is interesting to look at, but overall, we might be facing the same kind of problems that we're facing otherwise on secondary sanctions, and that building a digital currency is probably very important in the geo-economic competition, and it comes with lots of benefits, at least trying to do that and going down that route, because we don't know if we will end up needing it really, but the exercise is incredibly important, probably geopolitically, but probably not for resilience from secondary sanctions issues ultimately, because it poses some bigger difficulties. Another one on the right-hand side, market distortions. And that was a very creative approach to things, but that I think, at least as a think tank exercise, was very helpful. And that the idea here was the two areas where the EU is incredible, is very strong and credible, and where others in the world listen or watch very closely what the EU does. And there are more areas, of course, but certainly two are trade and then competition policy. And this is And on market distortion, this was an idea of can we change our competition policy in a way that integrates the negative and market distorting effects that secondary sanctions undoubtedly have, be it on a third market, that's even more difficult, but even on our own market and within Europe. And can we therefore, under our competition policy, levy fees and to redress that unfair advantage that secondary sanctions give to third country companies, and therefore impose fees under competition policy on other on US companies if when the US imposes secondary sanctions on European companies. Now that's, as I said, that was a sort of more creative approach, and there are big difficulties, not least the fact that we may want to avoid politicizing our competition policy to such a degree. But it may have been an interesting, or it definitely was an interesting thought experiment. But we did go, especially with two other instruments. But first, I'll just say what I've already said, that positive agenda and European strength are structurally and are the basis, your own economic strength, the basis for all, really. But then we did go into much more depth on these two options that, and one of them right in the middle, this idea of a collective defense instrument is, and Alina has mentioned it, is exactly the idea that we believe, at least, we will see next week when the Commission publishes it, is behind the anti-coercion instrument. And here the idea is that ideally in a rapport de force situation where this is ultimately a geopolitical and a power question, which is oftentimes where people end up on, with the question of secondary sanctions. We can, ideally, you'd want to be in a situation where you can reciprocate with the same measures. But of course, the euro is not comparable in strength and power to the dollar or in reach. There's other reasons why we can't easily just symmetrically reciprocate. So the idea of the collective defense instrument is to then impose countermeasures as part of our trade policy, where the EU is credible from a power point of view, and where we also can act collectively, because just as Alina said, I mean, one of the conclusions certainly also with these in conversations, I don't speak for these member states, but also in conversations with these member states, I mean, there was a prevailing sense that ideally that it's very difficult, at least, to respond to these challenges of economic coercion on the national level all by yourself, and installing a collective defense mechanism that lets you trigger countermeasures on the basis of the entire weight of the European market, be it tariffs, I will get to that in a second, investment restrictions, other restrictions. That was something we followed, or we looked at quite closely, and where we believed that could be the most promising, and I hate to say promising because no one wants to leverage countermeasures against the US, but the most promising option nonetheless, because if there was one lesson we thought that we could draw from the instance on aluminum and steel tariffs and some of the other situations we've been in under the Trump administration, it was that imposing a cost and only in a reactive way and only reciprocally, never in an escalatory way, actually works in deterring, or can work at least, in deterring the imposition of sanctions, secondary sanctions in the first place, just as Alina was saying. And the thinking here is that ideally, then, because there could be an equally big cost imposed on Americans, that Americans and Europeans will then refrain from taking such actions altogether and rather get together and talk and possibly decide on more cooperative ways of getting to the goals or policy goals that they're pursuing. The second option that we looked at, and that we also looked at in quite some detail, was the EU Resilience Office. And this idea is to install at a fairly high level in the Commission, not an EU OFAC, but a high-level interlocutor for OFAC and SECAT, by the way, the administration units in China that administers export controls, and other agencies like these, with several functions, but mostly to first have an interlocutor, but then also for strategic analysis and cost assessment, so that we finally get a much better idea of how much the use of secondary sanctions is costing European companies and European economies as a whole. And to point that out, I think that can already go quite a long way in a sort of, for example, in a yearly report, but also as a basis of intelligence, if you will, for using countermeasures, for instance, under the collective defense instrument or anti-coercion instrument, and also because many forms of economic coercion, not so much secondary sanctions, but I think it's even true on secondary sanctions to a degree. Many forms of economic coercion use gray zone areas, use even informal ways of pressuring companies, and a resilience office that takes stock and is even a go-to point for companies, and has the strategic view and compiles the strategic picture of what's going on, how much it's costing, could be incredibly helpful for having a much better view on things and for understanding the strategic situation. Two more options that I'll briefly mention, if my presentation will allow me. Yeah, the blocking statute, I won't say very much on that. It's the idea we had on the blocking statute is mainly to reverse or to change the logic, the way of its functioning, and not putting companies between a rock and a hard place, European companies between a rock and a hard place anymore, but rather changing the blocking statute into leaving compliance with secondary sanctions or sanctions listed in the annex illegal, of course, but making it easier for companies to obtain, and very easy even, or fairly easy to obtain a waiver, and to get them out of the situation of a rock and a hard place, but in exchange requiring companies to provide data or information on their transactions, on what's going on, that can feed the EU Resilience Office and the strategic picture, that can inform possible countermeasures even, and using this in exchange for a fairly easly obtainable waiver, using this information for going into or for the actual conflict that is there, and that conflict is political and is between the US and the EU and EU member states in the case of secondary sanctions, and the conflict is not between the EU and its own companies, which is sort of the logic that's behind it at the moment. So that's a very rough outline of the ideas we had there, or what we discussed with private and public sector actors. And a final one that I'll just point out here, and you can see there's more, but I'll have to come to an end. A European export bank, which is a sort of, the idea is a payment channel, financial policy option or a solution that we thought through, at least, if you will, an Instex plus, though with important caveats. We thought about, what if we build as Europeans a fully public European export bank that facilitates the trade that the market, because of the market intervention from a third country, doesn't provide, and provide the services, at least simple payment transfers, possibly with branches in other countries, in those countries concerned, and facilitate European trade. Many of you who know the topic and who follow Instex know how difficult that is to facilitate. So overall, as a big solution for industry and especially companies who themselves are active on the US market, that did not seem to be very promising. With the typical problems that many of you know and know better than me and us at ECFR, but one of the main issues, of course, is how the gateway or how do you get payments that arrive at the export bank into the regular financial system, and therefore make them usable and for you as a company. Maybe it is a marginal solution for some companies, especially SMEs, no US exposure themselves, no need for trade financing, maybe just a simple transfer, but even there are significant difficulties, as many of you know. But so we've looked at that quite in detail as well, and oftentimes our conclusion went back to these other three, or we went back to the other three policy options that I've talked about: collective defense, EU resilience, and blocking statute. And I think I'll stop here. I know my co-panelists will now talk about the anti-coercion instrument in detail, and I can always add or comment from what we thought about on this as well in more detail. But thanks so much, and back over to Ghent.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your views on the different options to deal with the secondary sanctions. As you mentioned, indeed, the next speaker will focus specifically on the EU's new anti-coercion instrument. So without further ado, I will immediately give the floor to Dr. Stefano Silegnardi. And then we'll deal with maybe first we'll listen to the presentation from the Chinese colleague, and then we'll have the Q&A session. I noticed there was already one question in the chat, so we'll then have maybe collect a number of questions together and have 2 rounds of questions afterwards. But first, Stefan, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Ruiz and all the organization of the conference. And I apologize because probably Alina and Jonathan just touched many topics of my presentation, so there will be some repetition, but I prefer not to change the scheme of my presentation, not to create confusion. So we already know that in 2021, from February 21, 2021, the Commission published a declaration in the official journal in which it expressed the idea to adopt a legislative proposal, here I'm quoting, for an instrument to dissuade or offset coercive actions by third countries, and which would allow the expeditious adoption of countermeasures triggered by such actions. If I have correctly understand that the proposal will be published next week, so it's just a question of date. And what we have now is some useful guidance on how this future instrument would look like, that can be inferred from the result of the public consultation that the EU Commission opened on March 2021 and closed on June 15, 2021. The first point I should mention is that it is very likely that this instrument will empower the Commission to apply trade, investment, or other restrictions toward a wide array of coercive behavior, economic behavior, from SPS regulation to local content requirement, denials of licenses, deliberate delays, boycott sanctions, and secondary sanctions. And thus, according to the object and purpose of the conference, the focus of my presentation will be only on reactive measures against secondary sanctions, not the other economic coercion. There are three main points that should be answered. The first is how and when should the EU Commission apply such countermeasures. The second is what countermeasures could the EU impose. And the third is how this instrument should relate with the EU blocking regulation. And I will start from that last point and then come back to the point number one, point number two. Even if probably during the Q&A, Alina will offer some more useful guidance than mine on that one. But I think there are 3 points on the relationship between the anti-coercion instrument and the EU blocking statute that can be mentioned on a sort of de lege ferenda perspective. The first is that the scopes of these two instruments are radically different. Whilst the anti-coercion instrument would allow to directly address third countries that deploy extraterritorial sanctions with economic countermeasures, the blocking regulation aim is different, as we already know. It is to shield EU natural and legal persons by prohibiting them from complying with another country's legislations or any decision, ruling, or award built thereon. The second point, and here the public consultation makes that point very clear, is that the anti-coercion instrument should focus on trade and investment responses to extraterritorial measures, whereas the strengthening of the blocking regulations should aim at adding the possibility to impose non-economic responses, such as, or to ease, for example, the enforcement of remedies before EU and non-EU judicial bodies. And finally, I think there exists also a difference between the two instruments on a ratione temporis level. I mean that the blocking statute has been projected, blocking regulation has been projected to operate as a mid-term protection shield against extraterritorial measures. On the contrary, the anti-coercion instrument, according to the information we possess, should be designed as a short-term and a rapid corrective tool for the imposition of swift economic countermeasures. But on that first point, I will stop here. So how and when should the EU impose countermeasures according to that instrument? Here, the issue is quite simple, at least with regards to secondary sanctions. We know that secondary sanctions, and we already say that a lot in the previous panels, that secondary sanctions are actually considered to be illegal by states, international organizations, and also the academic literature, as they undermine core principles of international law. For example, in its communication of the last 19th of January on the European Economic and Financial System fostering openness, strength, and resilience, I just counted that the EU Commission referred 14 times to the unlawful extraterritorial application to EU operators of unilateral sanctions by third countries. And thus, from the EU point of view, the qualification of secondary sanctions as a basis to adopt countermeasures, and thus the resulting inclusion, it's better to say that the inclusion of secondary sanctions as a basis to adopt countermeasures will not raise any concerns under the international law framework. And so, what countermeasures could the EU impose according to that new instrument? I think the difficult issue here is to define the exact amount of coercion that the EU may apply in enacting the countermeasures. In other words, which are the best possible ways in which Europe protects itself against secondary sanctions. Probably yesterday it was mentioned that for effective countermeasures, for the EU, the ideal scenario would be to create its own version of the OFAC in the US. This is a recurrent request in policy studies about how the EU might improve its procedure to adopt sanctions. but as it would result in the creation of a centralized entity with a resulting transfer of competences to Brussels, it is also a very unfeasible option for now. Thus the question is, where are the others dependent on the EU? And as Jonathan already said, there are some sectors which seems to be very promising for the adoption of countermeasures. Jonathan referred, for example, to investment restrictions, but there are also other sectors, for example, they are restricting access to the EU public procurement market, and also perhaps intellectual property rights. One could also imagine retaliatory measures focusing primarily on the specific sectors that are affected by the US or maybe Chinese extraterritorial sanctions. And this may take the form of denial of access, denial of licenses, and even targeted sanctions against individuals or entities. An example comes from China. China in 2019 adopted the unreliable entities list, which includes punitive measures such as, here I'm quoting, such as restrictions and prohibition on designated foreign entities, including companies, other organizations, or individuals, for conduct like sanction with extraterritorial application that are endangering the national sovereignty, security, or development interest of China. The area of export control, it seems promising, but is more problematic. And this is because export control is maybe carried out in a security logic, for example, the Wassenaar arrangements. And that means that the adoption of measures under that area, I think, would result in legal complexities and political obstacles, which render this option a very slow act to follow, I think. Further, we know that as international lawyer, in order to be permissible under the international law framework, the countermeasures that you will decide to adopt under that new instrument should respect the procedural and substantial requirement in Article 49 to 53 of the 2001 draft article of the International Law Commission. I will not repeat here all these requirements, as we all know. But I think the proportionality requirement in particular will play a prominent role as to the evaluation whether this new EU instrument will indeed establish an effective tool for countering secondary sanctions. And we will see next week what the proposal will say. I mean, there are three implications about proportionality that should be remarked. To start with, we know that proportionality is very difficult to measure in practice. But on the other hand, we also know that from a very pragmatic point of view, secondary sanctions are very aggressive and impact in the most severe way third states and economic operators. For the private sector, the situation becomes perhaps even more difficult due to the issue of overcompliance. And we talked a lot about overcompliance yesterday and this morning. And this is just to say that I think that under that perspective, the EU has ample room to maneuver on the proportionality issue. We should also not forget that such countermeasures will have collateral effects on trade and business in EU member states, and will likely impose costs on EU entities. For example, the respondents to the public consultation referred among these to uncertainty in businesses, additional costs in long-term contracts, enhanced administrative burdens in complying with new rules, compromised condition of cooperation, or that these countermeasures could affect the fundamental rights of doing business. To this end, for example, the study by Jonathan and his co-author of, I think it was June of 2021, proposed a mechanism to guarantee the swift removal of adopted countermeasures by the EU, or consider giving some compensation to EU companies to redress asymmetric effects. However, these are very delicate issues with legal complexities that need to be carefully addressed. For instance, it remains to see whether the EU Commission will decide to propose a simplified procedure to swiftly remove the countermeasures enacted, or which criteria will be advanced to calculate damages and to decide how compensations will be distributed. Finally, and on a more general level that does not consider only secondary sanctions. The risk exists that such an instrument could undermine the multilateral order and finally encourage protectionism. Should EU countermeasures be applied not in accordance with the requirements in Article 49 and 253 of the 2001 draft articles, the risk of retaliation by injured states and escalation should not be neglected. In other words, should you adopt an anti-coercion instrument without a sufficient justification and explanation under international law? This would allow third countries to establish the idea that it is the EU that is stepping out of international law, and it is not reacting against those subjects, those actors, which are stepping out of international law. And it is not difficult to predict that the EU might lose more in a bid for that escalation if you consider the increasing number of players not hesitating to weaponize trade to get their objectives in our days. For example, we have to consider that if the EU, the US remain the great champion of extraterritoriality, Article 14 of the recently adopted Chinese anti-foreign sanctions law provides that any individuals or entities may be held legally responsible if they do not follow the Chinese law or if they cooperate in implementing the countermeasures. And this provision may apply to both domestic and foreign companies operating outside of China. And this potentially has an extraterritorial effect, even if the extent of that application remains an open question. And to conclude, and here I'm concluding, it is clear that the adoption of that instrument will put the EU in front of a number of risks. But the EU also need to consider these risks against the cost of not having such an instrument. And from the specific angle of view of international law, I see in particular one great risk in case the EU will not adopt effective or insufficient responses to secondary sanctions. And I'm referring to the necessity to avoid that, here I'm quoting Professor Hackenbroich, to avoid that inaction by state confronting the practice of secondary sanctions be construed as a tacit consent to an evolution of the customary international law of state jurisdiction, which would leave the field open to hegemonic practices of certain states. And I conclude.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for your presentation. And now take into account that we had 3 presentations which all somehow tackled the same question: how does the EU respond to secondary sanctions? Where are we in terms of the development of the EU's instrument? I think it's best that we will have a Q&A session first with respect to the 3 presentations together. We'll then see whether we'll have time to show the video presentation, which was recorded by our Chinese colleagues, or otherwise it will also be shared with all registered participants. But in order to be sure that we have sufficient time for discussion, I want to open the floor right now. I noticed that there is already one question in the chat. So just have a look. Which was a question for Alina. The question was whether she could deal a little bit more with the apparent contradiction between strengthening the blocking statute and the facilitation of obtaining authorizations to comply with extraterritorial secondary sanctions, even in the form of general authorizations for strategic sectors, and which sectors this could be, the banking sector, for instance. Thanks, Alina, for your presentation. I don't know whether Antonius de Vries wants to add something to the question. I think the question is quite clear, so unless you want to intervene to clarify something, propose that I'll give the floor to Alina first. Maybe unless there are already some other questions here in the audience. Not at this stage. So then I suggest to give the floor to Alina so that she can respond already to this question.
Many thanks to Antonius for the question, and let me also start by thanking Jonathan and Stefano for their presentations. It's always great to see that we converge, or at least that's in the big elements we agree, or we're not very far apart. So that, at least from where I sit, from the policy contributor, not so much policy maker at my level, perspective, is very interesting. So on Antonio's question, it is a question that we get quite often. I think what we need to bear in mind several things when we address this. On the one hand is that the blocking statute is not going to help everybody. It cannot help absolutely everybody. It cannot solve all the problems. It will certainly, or this is what we think, once amended, solve more problems than it does today and help more people than it does today. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the blocking statute also needs to bear in mind, at least from now on, better the fact that there are sectors of the economy which many times don't really have a choice but to comply, and as long as the EU has not put in place or other measures which would support these sectors of the economy withstand pressure in the form of extraterritorial sanctions, secondary sanctions, if you will. And I know that there was a debate on whether there is an equivalence mark between the two. Then we need to also acknowledge that. So the idea is that the blocking statute would protect those who have no other choice but to be authorized, as it also does today, but in a clearer way. And also those who do not want to comply, who are hurt by compliance of others, and who in fact want to continue dealing with Iran. So I think the key to all this will be to figure out a system whereby literally only those who have no choice but to comply end up complying, are authorized to comply, and that we detect everybody else who complies out of overcompliance, fear, because it's more comfortable to do so, and to make sure that you're in line with the strongest sanctions around, although you may not be at risk of being sanctioned yourself through those under those extraterritorial secondary sanctions. So if we manage with the amended blocking statute to only allow to comply those who absolutely have no other choice, but make sure that the others do not, then I think we will have achieved much more than we do today, which is that basically, and quite honestly, everybody goes underground, everybody complies, and then victims of this compliance just need to figure out a way to handle themselves. And then there is another very important element in the new blocking statute that we do not currently have in it, which are the countermeasures. So there may be companies which absolutely need to comply with extraterritorial sanctions, but at the same time there will be countermeasures. There will be countermeasures that can be taken against those who benefit from extraterritorial sanctions. So right now I'm not telling you what's going to be in the text, but just ideas that have been also popping up in the public consultation. Because of course I can't give you an indication on what we're putting in there. So perhaps we can adopt countermeasures against those who have made the extraterritorial sanctions, extended the application of the extraterritorial sanctions to our companies. Perhaps we can adopt countermeasures against those who benefit from the application of extraterritorial sanctions. Perhaps we can make the damage clause so much better that those who suffer compliance with other people's compliance with extraterritorial sanctions can actually very easy become a clawback, use the clawback clause. Perhaps we can support with some sort of contractual boost in bilateral relations. So I'm really, well, not inventing, but quoting ideas that have been popping up. Perhaps, as the Advocate General has already said, we could reverse the burden of proof. So, okay, we authorize those who absolutely need to comply, to comply, but we reverse the burden of proof for everybody else so that damages can be claimed much more easily. So there's a whole array of ideas that are being that we're working on to make sure that authorizing some and authorizing very few from now on does not necessarily mean that the blocking statute becomes pointless. And I'm sure all this will be much clearer once you see the proposal. But for the moment, you'll just need to believe me that this is what we're trying to put in. Thank you so much, Antonis.
Thank you very much indeed.
Could I give a short reaction to Alina's reply?
Yeah, sure, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alina. We know each other. In fact, you are now dealing longer with blocking statute than I ever did. But I'm not really convinced by this argument, because as I see it, what you have called strategic sectors, that is not very clear. I give it as an example, and we have heard it also this morning. The banking sector will say, we have no choice than to comply because we need the US dollar financial system, and that means that we have to use the US financial institutions, and therefore we always will be vulnerable. But I don't know which other sectors you are thinking about, but probably more. But there are other companies that is also during these days become clear. They say more or less immune for the secondary sanctions because they have no links or no significant links with the US market. In this case, I refer only to the US market, maybe other markets from other countries. And therefore, they don't care if they lose some business in the United States. And then there may be a whole lot of companies who are really saying, well, anyhow, I will suffer. Even if I get an authorization, it means that I comply with the American, in this the third country legislation, or let's say secondary sanctions, and therefore I lose the business to the third countries, which may be 40% of my turnover. It might be the other way around. Companies say, okay, the third country that is sanctioned directly by the United States is representing 60% of my turnover, and then I have to give up the 40% in the United States. Whatever, they will suffer if they get an authorization or not. And that is what I said. This is something that you have to take in a global context. If there are too many companies that would suffer one way or another, maybe you should simply say we go for other measures in the anti-coercion instrument, and then see what we can do without increasing the suffering of the companies. That is why I came to the conclusion that it was already a mistake in 1996 to rush through this blocking statute with this hard lock and hard place in a rock or a catch-22 situation. And I still are convinced. Well, I think that the European Court, following the Advocate General, will say you have really to make up your mind as a Commission, because you cannot put companies in this kind of situation. But we will see what the Commission will come forward with. I wish you all the luck with that. I have just one additional question. Maybe the public consultation, which has indeed given more replies than we saw even on the 4th of November, but we get to 86. Is the Commission going to make public those replies that, of which the authors have said you can publish them? You can publish my comments or commentaries, because you did it already for the consultation in August. And it would certainly be interesting in the full panoply of replies that the Commission did receive. Thank you very much, Alina, again.
So perhaps with your permission, I'll just answer the second question that I just received, and definitely if participants have allowed us to publish the replies, then there's no problem not to. Now, I would not be able to tell you how many of them did that, but I do remember quite a high number of replies saying, please don't even think about publishing this. So actually, no, please just don't even think about it. And it's actually logical if you think about what sort of reputational and secondary extraterritorial risks some people take with their replies. And then if I may, I also wanted to add one thing which I didn't say, which is that, of course, even with this much better blocking statute that we think we can come up with, we still hope that it will be a legal act that does not need to be applied, because the countermeasures, the deterring effect that we're going to propose, which is definitely not there today and we're going to add, will have worked. And also because hopefully the more diplomatic outreach and discussions with third countries will bear more fruit than it has so far. And this is something I indeed had not mentioned, that this has never stopped and it's not going to stop. The blocking statute will simply be, as the anti-coercion instruments and as other instruments we may come up with. All you need to do is look at the communication in January to see how many other ideas are there. And even better, I would say, but don't quote me on this to my hierarchy, look at Jonathan's presentation as to how many other ideas could be put in place. So all this will have to work in combination. Only the blocking statute or only the anti-coercion instrument will not solve the whole problem.
Thank you very much, again, Alina, for the answers. There's one question here.
Okay, well, if I may, some questions for Alina. It's a great pleasure to see you as always, and I've enjoyed the presentation. Just a few small questions. You mentioned the bank money proceedings, and I recall in the opinion of the Advocate General there is a suggestion that that a company can in a way invoke ethical considerations to justify why it has aborted trade relationships, transactions with existing clients, as a defense against an accusation of a breach of the blocking statute. It's still, of course, uncertain whether that argument will be picked up by the court in its final judgment, but do you consider that to be a loophole that might undermine the prohibition aspect of the blocking statute, which I understand that will be preserved in the amended version of that? That's what I read between the lines. So that is the first question. A second one, I read in a recent report published by your department that there are a number of proceedings in the United States before domestic courts against EU companies over alleged breaches of secondary sanctions, where if I understand correctly, the US judge has suspended the proceedings to allow these EU companies to secure an authorization from your services. That resembles a bit of a chicken race to see who's going to give in first. How do you deal with such requests in a way? If you can answer that, I'm not sure if you really can in your position. And a last one. You mentioned countermeasures against companies that benefit from secondary sanctions. But if I look at this, I look at it from an international law perspective, and I have to give my own background. And I would argue that countermeasures can only be taken against the author of a wrongful act, not against someone who benefits from a wrongful act. So legally speaking, is that are you on solid ground there? Just three questions which I will leave with you. And maybe another one for Stefano on the anti-coercion instrument. You mentioned the proportionality aspect and the problem in applying that in such a difficult political context. But of course, there is also the triggering aspect. It all begins with identifying what conduct justifies reliance on the various on the more offensive measures that will be included in the anti-coercion instrument. And the triggering event would not be extraterritoriality as such, if I understand correctly. Rather, the key concept here is coercion. How would you define it? How can it be defined? Also, keeping in mind the EU's own the measures it takes itself, but within the sanctions domain or beyond. So this is a question which is, I think, broader than secondary sanctions or sanctions at large, but how would we construe a notion as coercion in light of international law? Any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Chair, there's already a round of questions. I propose that, to start with Alina first and then to give the floor to Stefan.
Well, as ever, but I didn't have any doubts. Professor Royce puts the dots on the i's and makes my life difficult, but that is absolutely great. That's also why I'm here for. So let me start with maybe in the order of the questions. Now, on the ethical considerations, I of course can't say very much because the case is ongoing, and needless to say, we are intervening in that case, and needless to say, my team has been looking, if not even drafting in support of the legal service parts of the commission submission. So there's not enormous amounts of information I can give, but in my very private capacity right now, I would say that as you know, the frequently asked questions that we currently have on the blocking statute say that if a company wishes has business considerations, purely business considerations, not to deal with Iran or with Cuba or with any other third country subject to extraterritorial sanctions, then they may take a business decision not to. The only condition is that their business decision is not conditioned, is not aimed at complying with the extraterritorial sanctions. So I would say that ethical considerations can also be part of those business considerations of, I would want to open a bank account in a bank that is ethical, I would not want to open a bank account in another that is not, etc. So that is perfectly possible. I think ethical considerations can be part of the decision. So far, nothing against what the Advocate General said. On the other hand, I think ethical considerations will be quite difficult to sustain in that particular case we're talking about, because funnily enough, those ethical considerations did not exist until the extraterritorial sanctions came back in place, although the human rights situation in the country or state was absolutely identical as it is after the imposition of sanctions, although the EU still had human rights sanctions on that country even before, when business was still going on. So I think in the concrete case it would be difficult. Otherwise, well, of course, can be one of the considerations that companies might have. Of course, if the court follows the Advocate General also on this point, it will be for the companies apparently complying to demonstrate that they're not, and that all these considerations are actually not a wish to comply with extraterritorial sanctions. So that much about the first question. I think you see where I stand on that one. On the US cases, is this really a race? I think that the US case is currently pending where the courts have acknowledged that the value of the blocking statute are for us one of the best illustration of why the blocking statute is not dead. That's why we're trying to revive it, to make it better and not to get away from it. It was a joy when US courts indeed recognized that companies cannot appear before them and defend themselves until and unless they're authorized by the Commission to do so. It is, of course, also a very sensitive situation, because what do? Do you authorize companies to go to the US courts and thereby subject themselves to US jurisdiction and whatever may come out of that? Do you say no, stay home, don't go, and then risk? You never know, because this has not been settled yet. You never know whether the case would continue without them, so in absentia, and then it can be very complicated. I cannot tell you what the solution is, because the cases are still ongoing. But again, I think we have come up with an idea that could help the companies while not putting them in an untenable situation. And again, suspense, I cannot really tell you what that is. Sometimes I get away with it a little bit too easily, I find. And then on countermeasures, I think, yes, it is true. I should have remembered. I am addressing an audience of distinguished lawyers and specialists in international law. We call countermeasure everything. It's a bit of a commonplace. We call countermeasure in this area, where when we talk about the blocking statute, anything that is a more offensive or a more, I wouldn't use the word aggressive. I think offensive is the best way to say it. Measure that we might want to put in place, something that would hit back and somehow impose the cost, which so far is only borne by EU companies, on the companies of the country imposing the sanctions. And on top of that, so it's a generic word, it's not the typical countermeasures in international law. And that's one thing. And on the other hand, what we have seen is that on many occasions when secondary extraterritorial sanctions bite, it's not in and of themselves only, it's also through the intermediation of private operators who very willingly make those applicable, although there is no need to. I think that's also important to bear in mind for that. And I'll leave it at that because I think there was, I'm sure there are other questions and that Stefano wants to address the other one.
Okay, thank you. And Stefano.
The question is, what coercion are we responding to under such instrument, apart from secondary sanctions? And here I can refer to the public consultation, because the Commission here I read that is the Commission in its public consultation provides a definition of coercion for this instrument, and it says that coercive practice by non-EU countries are measures which seek to or could coerce public authority in the EU to take, not take, or withdraw particular policy measures. This practice may include the use or threat of coercion, possibly in the form of trade or investment restrictions. The coercion may or may not be based on existing legislation and can affect any field in which the EU or its member states are active. So it's a very vague definition of coercion. And the respondent to the public consultations seems to accept that definition, but with just one remark, that it is to include coercion specifically against private economic operators and to expressly cover extraterritorial sanctions because of the significant economic implication of this practice. So a vague definition of coercions, but a definition that lacks something on the side of economic private operators, just to cover also secondary sanctions. And this is what the Commission, and I don't know, probably the anti-coercion instrument next week will say about that. I don't know.
Okay, I have two questions. Maybe we'll collect some questions. Two questions here in the audience. I noticed that also Jonathan raised his hand. Was there a comment you wanted to make on the previous questions?
We can maybe I can come back after
okay,
some more questions.
Afterwards. So we'll now take the two sets of questions from the audience first. Yeah.
Thank you. Briefly, it's a question for Ms. Nedea and perhaps also for Dr. Silingardi. I'm still not clear about the overlap or the combination between the blocking regulation and the anti-coercion instrument. If we block foreign sanctions, can we still adopt countermeasures? Or will Antony Blinken say, oh, wait a minute, but you blocked them? And so how do they combine? Can they combine efficiently or not? Thank you.
Probably, I leave the answer to Alina before.
And a question for Jonathan. Thanks so much for your presentation and also for the report. I have a question about that European Export Bank, which basically builds on Instex, as I understand. Instex plus, you say, payment transfers. But I was wondering whether one can truly avoid US sanctions. To me, or to the US, it might seem like a form of circumvention, which could still be subject to US jurisdiction. That's at least what some US policymakers were saying. And also, yesterday we learned from Susan Emenegger that somehow the United States will always know where to find you. So I was wondering about the possibilities of that European Export Bank, and also what's the status of Instex right now? Is there already an assessment of how that's functioning? You were relatively negative, I thought, in your presentation. Is that the future, or is it something that we should also get rid of, actually? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe the first question was essentially addressed to Alina, if I understand. You prefer Alina to respond to that first, and then we have this third question for John.
Okay, so I think it's a very good question, because one of the I wouldn't call it the elephant in the room, but one of the very important unknowns at this stage is how exactly the blocking statute and the anti-coercion instrument are going to work together. And Stefano was mentioning earlier as well that the definition that was proposed in the impact assessment on the anti-coercion instrument referred to extraterritorial sanctions, but did not take a position on whether yes, no, applicable, not applicable, included, not included. So this is something that will probably be clarified in 5 days from now when the proposal is adopted. Now, how would they combine in the sense that, of course, if assuming, and here we are assuming that the anti-coercion instrument will be applicable to extraterritorial sanctions, if we are successful in the first place with the blocking statute to deter the imposition of sanctions. So let's say that the common named countermeasures that we are going to propose are so effective that third countries say, I'm not going to impose any further extraterritorial sanctions because I don't want that to happen. Then there is nothing to counter any further. There's no problem. So not only the anti-coercion instrument would not have a reason to apply to that situation, but even the blocking statute would simply have achieved its main purpose, which is to deter without having to fight back. Now, of course, if the countermeasures in the blocking statute have not been successful and we still have extraterritorial sanctions, then we'll need to counter them once they appear as through the measures that we're going to put in place. We're going to try to do that. We're going to apply all those measures and see how they how successful they are. If that doesn't work, so I would imagine one of the options would be, if again, assuming that the anti-coercion instrument remains applicable, is going to be applicable to extraterritorial sanctions, that we can somehow mix and match the measures in the blocking statute and those in the anti-coercion instrument, whether at the same time, because in the end they're two legal instruments, or subsequently, first the blocking statute because it addresses extraterritorial sanctions specifically, and then the anti-coercion instrument as the other gun that we can fire to solve the problem. So I know it's a very yet again an unsatisfactory answer, because I can't tell you what the anti-coercion instrument is going to do, and because it's only in 1 week time that we'll know the proposal, and even less what the blocking statute exactly is going to do in our proposal, because we're quite a few months away from that. But perhaps we can repeat, just an idea, we can repeat this conference once the proposal for the blocking statute is also there. Hopefully we'll all be able to meet in person by then, and then we repeat the debate.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Sorry, should I go? I just didn't hear you.
Yes, please. Yes, answer the question.
Yeah, happy to. One question was about the export bank. Maybe I'll start there. I think, yeah, the question is very legitimate, and is exactly what the sort of what our sense was based on, you know, this task force consultation and based on our research, that I think if the EU wants to, if the US wants to, then this is a very, then it becomes difficult to avoid US sanctions through even through such an expert bank. The question, though, is more political in the end, or let me say, there's numerous, you know, technical difficulties and so forth, and, you know, you would have to probably oblige commercial banks to accept payments from the export bank so that they can enter the normal financial system. That there's a question of is that an undue interference with contractual freedoms? Maybe the case can be made that that's still necessary because of because of security interests. I'm not a lawyer on this, but that's certainly one obstacle. Another one is that those commercial banks could still choose not to accept a payment from the export bank, even if they're legally required to, because because that's been the calculation all along, right? Is that whatever the fee is that you pay here in Europe for not complying with legal provisions here is probably less consequential for your business than not accessing the dollar market, and so and that's just such a big rock that the hard place that Europeans can create if they want to is at least generally speaking difficult to make hard enough for it to be a clear choice, and also that's probably not the ideal situation you want to be in or put your companies in. So those are basic questions. There's lots of other questions, but I will say something. If there is a lesson from the maximum pressure policies in the US, then that maximum pressure doesn't, politics or political desirability aside, doesn't work mechanically, and that Iranian tankers, Cuban doctors, other actors, eventually the more you go after them and the more you apply maximum pressure, is the more you create axes of convenience or axes, actors that are outside the reach of US sanctions and that can help each other and so forth. So for the situation where there is significant sanctions misuse, and I'm saying really significant sanctions misuse, in under a possible Trump 2 administration, but I hope not, of course, then it becomes less clear that eventually the idea of an export bank may actually work, because the more the greater US sanctions overuse, the further you push many more actors to thinking about alternative ways of transacting with each other. But I think that's something that's fairly well understood in Washington, and certainly, I mean, with the people I just talked to where I just got back from there, and so with, I think, absent of that, and then we have a lot of problems also transatlantically when we get to that point. So absent of that, I think it's a very, very difficult policy option, and even then it's a difficult policy option, the export bank. So maybe hopefully that does. But there comes a point where, politically speaking, I think Europeans can also take some comfort in the fact that the US is not interested and should not be interested in complete screw up in transatlantic relations, and will also listen to the fact that its closest friends and allies have significant problems with the way it's misusing sanctions, if that's the case, or when that's the case, and so politically speaking, using US sanctions on a public official and on a public export bank staffed with public officials, or on people transacting with it on perfectly legal under European law, is a political step, even if you can technically do it, is a political step that and one that puts your overall sanctions regime so much at risk, or in your sanctions powers, that one would hope that the US would think twice as well, and that ideally we don't need the export bank, and can solve these issues very differently. So that's maybe my 5 cents on the export bank. On the anti-coercion instrument, I just wanted to add just on 2 questions, or maybe just on the definition, what the idea is as far as we will all see, but as far as we understand is, and that's certainly something that's attractive also in other places, including in Washington, actually, or can be seen as a good approach and a very European approach, is that this is obviously a country agnostic instrument, but also one that's not based on national security or those kinds of provisions in WTO and trade law, but that it's based on broader public international law and an interference, and the trigger, if you will, is an interference in the sovereignty of a member state or several member states' affairs, and core parts, tax policy, if you will, energy policy, possibly core functions of state sovereignty, and that through coercion, is economic coercion, get violated. So maybe that remains vague probably, but that's a sort of that is, I think, and at least the way we thought about it, the idea of then allowing for countermeasures, trade and investment countermeasures.
Okay, thank you very much. Stefano, was there something you wanted to add on the coercion? Okay, Tom.
I can pose one or two more questions. I believe that the recording by our Chinese colleague will no longer be shown in this session, that we will rather communicate the recording to the participants in the conference and maybe post it online later on. But I think that we perhaps do need to briefly address China. It's been touched upon already by Stefano, but I also know that in some of the documents of the European Council on Foreign Relations, there's this acknowledgement that when we discuss second-age sanctions, we tend to focus on the United States, but the ECFR's view is that perhaps China is the more systemic rival for the European Union. And the question is whether perhaps Jonathan and Stefano could clarify a little bit more to what extent you believe that within the sanctions domain, China is indeed acting extraterritorially. Because, of course, formally speaking, China often denounces or objects to extraterritorial approaches within this domain and elsewhere. So to what extent indeed does China engages in the adoption of extraterritorial sanctions? A few thoughts on that would be welcome. And maybe also conversely on the blocking statute. Well, one thing that struck me when reading the consultation on the anti-coercion instrument is that I believe one of the respondents gave us an example of a form of coercion, precisely the recently adopted Chinese blocking statute. And now that is, of course, a bit awkward or, well, thought-provoking to say the least. Clearly, if we consider an EU blocking statute to be a legitimate tool, then shouldn't the same be true for a Chinese version thereof? And the question there is perhaps more to Alina and Jonathan. Are there certain fundamental distinctions between the European blocking statute as it currently exists or as it will develop, and the Chinese version that would justify a different appraisal of these instruments? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom, for raising the China factor. Maybe it's good that the three panelists can briefly respond on this. Maybe I'll start with Jonathan, then Alina, maybe first in line. So Jonathan, Alina, and then Stefan. Okay,
great. Thanks. I hope I understood correctly that I'm to go. But no one else started speaking, so I just have trouble hearing sometimes. But I did get the questions right, I think. So on China's extraterritoriality, I think, and this goes to maybe if you permit, that it's just easiest and quickest, and I will take the least time if I put this slide up. That is the best response to that. And this is the sort of framework on weaponized interdependence by Abe Newman and Henry Farrell in the US. And the idea here is that the way secondary sanctions function is that you use what you need is in yellow is the preconditions sort of. You need a network asymmetry, so you need to be a central hub in an international global network. I think it's clear to everyone why that is the case on the dollar, and why the dollar and dollar clearing and Wall Street are such a central hub in the system. Then, and if you have effective jurisdiction over it and appropriate institutions to use it, to make use of that, then you can enjoy two effects that we, I think, as Europeans would probably qualify as something like extraterritorial coercion, and this is not probably a legal way I'm using it now, but you have this panopticon effect, so you get insights and into transactions, into all kinds of information on what's happening in the network, because you're in such a central place, and you enjoy a choke point effect, which is exactly what we all know is happening, is that you can cut off people from the system, or you can condition access to the system through the choke point. And I'm just mentioning this because that sort of more general and abstract concept illustrates that while China is not anywhere close to, certainly not close to such a being a central hub as the US is on the dollar, you can imagine these effects that China can enjoy these effects in certain areas, on key technologies, on even to an extent through a digital renminbi. I'm not comparing the two, not to the power of the dollar, but certainly on the panopticon effect, it's very clear that that the digital renminbi will create perfect insights, almost perfect insights into all kinds of transactions, and that China can and will increasingly through being central in to economic networks, enjoy at least the possibility of using extraterritoriality. And then very concretely, if you look at the new export control law, re-export rules were not included in after all, but there was a lot of thinking about that, so, which are de facto extraterritorial, or can be used at least in such ways. But there's still a significant use of you can be blacklisted if you don't comply with export control law provisions, including such things as transferring the product that originally comes from China to other companies, or changing its end use. And if that goes against national security or national interests of China, is what the law states, then you can be subject to punishment. And that's where we're getting closer to extraterritoriality and to a far reach of legal requirements that originally are just meant to be governing, or ideally are just meant to be governing Chinese exports, just as an example. So I think considering that extraterritoriality is only a problem that we face with the US would be slightly too short-sighted, is what I would argue.
Okay, thank you. Alina, your views on this?
I think it's I'm in a very comfortable position where, just like when the very orderly council meetings happen, I can simply raise my flag to say I agree with the previous speaker, and save you the trouble of listening to me for too long. Let me also say, so I definitely agree that China is a potential troublemaker in the area of extraterritorial sanctions. No doubt about that. There was also the question on whether the Chinese blocking statute, on the Chinese blocking statute. I think we were on the one hand quite proud to see that we have become the model of blocking statutes around the world. On the other hand, it is a little bit unsettling for one particular reason, which is that while for us it is quite clear what the rules of interpretation of a legal text are, we have a court of justice which is quite famous for not being deferential to the administration, which is just fine, of course. when we look at the Chinese blocking statute, we're not entirely sure. We don't have that kind of clarity and certainty from on the other side on how discretionally the provisions can be applied. How exactly will they be interpreted? How exactly will they affect joint ventures, for instance, of EU companies in China? So there, I think we are slightly uncomfortable as to what may happen, but in principle, we of course have nothing against countries asserting their position that extraterritorial sanctions are unacceptable. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
I'm not very much already answered to the question. But just to say that to complicate the matters, the things, the anti-foreign sanction law, the Chinese anti-foreign sanction laws comes without any guidance. We are now used to have guidance, not the Chinese. Quite, there's no specificity in the articles of the anti-foreign sanction law, so it's not simple to understand. As already Jonathan said, what kind of extraterritorial reach these sanctions may have in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any additional questions, either from the audience or from people who are following online? So whether I can see any hands in the room or any virtual hands on the Zoom? No. Ah, okay. There's one. Maybe Antonio, so you want to ask your question in person? You can intervene if you want. Otherwise, I can read the question.
Thank you, but it was not so much a question as a remark that if the Commission would apply the criterion, say any EU company can comply with, let's say, extraterritorial or secondary sanctions of any third country, if that third country, European company has no choice then to comply, because otherwise it would go, let's say, go bankrupt or cause serious damage to its business model. Then also China could use secondary sanctions for whatever directed against any country, for instance, the United States. And the Commission would have to allow compliance with the Chinese secondary sanctions, for instance, in the field of rare earths. Companies that need rare earths materials say, well, we cannot consist and not continue our business if we cannot deal with China. It is just a remark to say, and I think Alina also referred to this, it's very difficult to estimate at this moment what kind of possibilities you have if China would raise to a level of economic financial power, let's say to a certain extent, comparable with that of the economic financial power, global power, the United States has at this moment. The best thing is, of course, we as Europe, we should rise them ourselves to a level of such power. But I'm afraid that we can only do this in very close cooperation with the United States, which makes it more difficult to go for instruments which say to the United States, well, we want to be autonomous. But we know all this kind of dilemmas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see that Jonathan wants to answer. Jonathan, please, you have the floor.
Thanks. Just triggered a thought and also some a comment what Antonius was saying, which always really interesting and important comments, and it's fun to discuss with you. I think actually on the anti-coercion instrument, my sense was in Washington, my sense was that this was rather either welcomed, fantastic development is something that someone in DC said, or at least understood, even if there are some worries that it could be used against the US. My sense was not that this is something that that Americans will take as a hostile action or will view as something that that you know Europe has no right to do or so. I think I'm actually I think ultimately it comes down to the question of whether the US thinks it's good to have a strong Europe that can defend itself against economic coercion. You know, I think if China did something like it did to Australia, curbing 10% of exports to someone in Europe, to a European member state or so, and then a strong Europe can also defend itself a little better and stand up for its own interests in relations with the US. But that's probably preferable for many in the US than a weak Europe that can defend itself against economic coercion. So that's certainly something I've taken away with. I've taken away, and I think the debate is moving exactly in that direction. Is that we need to strengthen Europe against China, and that's certainly something that, as part of the TTC and everything, that the US and Europe are discussing together. So I'm politically speaking, I'm actually fairly optimistic that that's helpful, but that's just my thought on this.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm also watching at the time. Just give a last opportunity if there would be any burning issues or questions you still want to raise or add, either online or here. Don't immediately see any reactions. So at this point, I think it's time to finish this panel, and I will hand over the floor to Cedric for the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for chairing that last panel. So we've come to the end of our conference. It's 4 o'clock, and as co-organizer, I'm of course obliged to say that it was wide-ranging, thought-provoking, and rich. But certainly that's true, isn't it? Despite it's on Friday, I will just highlight a few takeaways from our conference with your permission. First, in terms of terminology, we've discussed that quite a lot. And I think that secondary sanctions may mean different things to different people, but I think we have an intuition or an understanding that this is about sanctions legislation which aims to limit and limits, in fact, transactions between parties outside the sanctions center, so located in third states. We also understand that very few states actually use secondary sanctions, and we've talked a lot about the United States, but perhaps you should be talking also about China and perhaps even about the EU in the future also as a secondary sanctions center. So something that we discussed also today. Second, in terms of impact, we've also learned secondary sanctions can cause headaches. Headaches for international business operators, but also headaches for states limiting economic freedom, and of course also impacting on the population at large. We've also heard that international economic operators go to great lengths to take into account and to comply with US sanctions when taking business decisions, when choosing business partners, investing, transacting with particular countries and with particular persons. Secondary sanctions regimes, or US sanctions regimes, were in particular also difficult to navigate at times, and they require companies also to hire sanctions compliance specialists, which also comes with extra costs and extra tax in a way on doing business. Third, the law.
Secondary sanctions adversely affect operators and individuals. That's quite clear, but that doesn't make them ipso facto illegal. But we've also learned that there are some concerns under international law. Possibly such sanctions could become considered as coercive. That's why this anti-coercion instrument. And coercion is also a central term, I believe, in our discussions, violating then the principle of non-intervention under customary international law. May also violate the law of jurisdiction. That was the panel that I was chairing, and to the extent that they lack genuine connection to the regulating state. We've also discussed today that they may violate international monetary law, trade law, and international investment law. But it remains the case, I believe, that there is very little guidance from international dispute settlement bodies. So we are confronted really with a field that is quite unsettled. Now, at the same time, certain secondary sanctions regimes could be unlawful under domestic law, under national law. So we've also learned that secondary sanctions could possibly be challenged before US courts, and some cases might be pending, a presumption against extraterritoriality. We've talked about that. We've also talked about foreign courts today, hearing contract cases, being confronted with US sanctions, and then sometimes limiting their effectiveness by rejecting a force majeure defense. We've also heard a lot about blocking regulations, especially today, but also at the very beginning yesterday, EU and also China to a certain extent. EU blocking statute not having been very successful to date, but this may perhaps change soon. The key question is, of course, will this revised regulation also change the incentives for operators? We will learn more the coming weeks, I'm sure. Then fourth, the way ahead in terms of the conference follow-up. So Tom and I, we have the idea to publish a volume based on the papers that were presented at the conference yesterday and today, but we will shortly be in touch with the authors in this respect, also on the setup and on the content of the papers. Fifth and final, a word of thanks to everyone who joined in Ghent or online, talking about speakers, chairs, but very much so also all the participants. I was one of the co-organizers on behalf of Utrecht University, on behalf of Renfels, but I believe that the credit should really go to Ghent University, which offered this wonderful venue and who staff worked very hard really to make this happen. And special thanks to Tom Ruijs, to Christine Ballekeer, to Felipe Rodriguez, and also to Peter van Damme, who gave the very necessary technical support. And a special thanks, of course, also goes to our sponsors. To all, have a safe trip back home and enjoy your weekend. Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.